Thinking about the artificial intrusions that are being offered to us and the solutions, the whole idea of the problem, reaction, solution nature of the technocratic world and the industrial world and the commercial world. Today specifically, I'm thinking more about the idea of IVF, in vitro fertilization, test tube babies, and all these technologies and offerings that are being pushed into consciousness over the last couple of decades regarding birthing and parenting, and these things that are absolutely critical to the proliferation and propagation and survivorship of the human species. And these ideas are becoming normalized because they're so prevalent now. And basically because there's profit to be made. Crazy amounts of profit. And of course that's an extension of the cartel medicine, pharmaceutical industrial complex. And those psychopaths are experts at parasitism and predatory business practices and corporate structures integrated into governance, into academia, into education, all powerful and ever present in the mainstream, even of course in media, films, television shows. Their little ideas are plugged and promoted everywhere you look, every type of media that you ingest. So these things are being normalized, and the bigger issue, if we're not aware of it and if we're not doing anything to counter these narratives, if we're not being awake and aware to these processes and what's going on, and the fact that we're normalizing all these ridiculous synthetic and artificial means with which to perpetuate a human and to raise a human and to train a human and to inculcate a human with ideas and beliefs and paradigms, it'll be, as it is now already, it's become normalized over the last generation. And now the kids that are growing up with screens and robots and the Alexas and the Googles and these ever-present technologies that you can speak to get information, the AI and all the rest of it, it's going to be such that, similar to ideas like gravity. I was listening to Michael Neal in one of his presentations. It works, it's a truth, even though scientifically it's incomplete and a theory, but in general, it's something we grew up with. And because we grew up with it, we accept that it is real. We can hold a pen out in front of us, drop it to the floor. Every single time it's going to fall and hit the floor. So that kind of truth is what I'm talking about. It's fundamental, even though it's incomplete and doesn't work in all situations for everyone. It's good enough that in general, for the general population, they accept the idea that gravity is real. Now, when we talk about birthing, conception, parenting, all these other things, when we talk about children as toddlers and infants having screens in their hands and access to this technology that's ubiquitous just because their parents, of course, grew up with it, so it's normal, it's acceptable, it's real, and just part of life. So their kids, the kids that are growing up right now, are this, second and third generation with the ubiquity of the internet and networking, smartphones, smart devices, tablets, and now AI. It's simply going to be such that it's so integrated, it's just a truth. It's just part of life. It's just how things are done. It's normalized. So we really need to think about that and how it applies to our implementation and addiction and widespread use of these various types of technology, whether it's medical or academic, financial, governmental, wherever it applies, which is essentially everywhere now, because that's what they, the self-professed owners of the world, the controllers as it were, would prefer. Because there's money in it, there's power in it, there's control, yada yada yada. It's the same old thing, and they're going to make up every possible reason for us to consider this a normal thing, that it should be implemented, that it's safe and effective, that it's progress, that it is efficiency, that it's a hack, it's a cheat, it's an improvement over the silly, clunky, ridiculous, organic, human, living man or woman. And of course that's bullshit. That's all sophistry, that's all manipulation, that's conjecture, speculation, that's the fabricated and the manufactured being pushed into your brain, into your consciousness from every angle all the time, such that it seems to be true, when in fact it is still only artificial. It is synthetic. It is dead and soulless. So we really need to be aware of what we're exposing ourselves and our family, and specifically our children to. And that includes everything to the ideas that we're accepting and normalizing. That has to do with coupling, conception, pregnancy, birthing, raising a child. All of these critical steps are being infiltrated and imposed upon by the technocracy, the corporatocracy, and the various industrial complexes that seem to know better than you, better than anyone, how these things should happen and what's best and what is safest and what protocol should be considered to medicalize these ideas and to funnel them all into the materialistic scientism of modern medicine and science, which is a complete joke. Think about what you grew up with and what was normalized and what became accepted simply because it was just there all the time, something that you were exposed to with regularity, something that you didn't question or have any issues with. When I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, before the internet. Imagine that. I remember even an older television that we had, huge tube thing, even had a wired remote. It was ridiculous, but eventually we got the wireless remotes and the VCRs and then the DVD players and all the rest of it that slowly came along and emerged. Back in the day, TV wasn't a big deal. Having 12 or 13 channels was ample, and there was still nothing to watch, right? And you had to watch the ads and all the rest of it, whereas today you have unlimited streams of whatever you want that you can extremely narrow your perception and perspectives of the world, because you can watch only the things that interest you from specific people, specific sources, and specific providers and influencers that agree or you find agreeable. And of course, that's not a good thing either. We need to be exposed to many different angles of any particular idea. So the problem with this technocratic revolution and agenda that's going on is that they, of course, are force-feeding us the ideas of improvement and progress, and that technology is necessary in making things easier, more efficient, when none of that is true. It's never been true. Not once have they actually truly improved things for the general population. But they have found new and different ways to terrify people and to scare them into submission and consent and misinforming and disinforming a population about ideas regarding conception, birthing, raising a child. So, of course, that brings us back to what have you grown up and accepted as normal and never really questioned? What are your children now, if you have them, or the children that you may be around, teaching or otherwise? What are you helping to normalize for them? There's certain conveniences that are injected and introduced into the academy and various institutions where children go and spend a lot of their time if they're not homeschooled or unschooled, whatever you want to call that. So the more you're handing them off to the state or to the institution, the less responsibility and accountability you have. But at the same time, when problems arise, and they will, how are you going to deal with it when you have no framework, you have no concept of what they've been through or what they're being exposed to, which is the next generation of what you yourself went through as a child, right? So things that you grew up with, you could already see that certain technologies came along that made life easier, that made things a little more interesting. And now we have these smart devices like the smartphones. We have access to essentially all of human knowledge and creativity at our fingertips. Yet we have to be extremely discerning as to where we go about finding that information, because every search engine, every browser that you use, every particular centralized information data set, data provider curates information so that you see specific information based on who pays for that service or who owns it, and the ideologies and beliefs and paradigms behind those involved. Understand that no child has ever needed a smartphone or a tablet, AI, or the internet to grow up healthy, intelligent, understanding, speaking multiple languages, learning how to do everything they need to do to take care of the basic necessities of life, from cooking to some basic mechanics, even a bit of construction or carpentry, maybe electrical, plumbing, reading, writing, and then pursuing the arts, music, painting, carving, sculpture, acting, theater. We've never in the history of humanity required a smartphone or a tablet or the internet to do any of these things successfully. In fact, what we've found over the last generation or so, and especially in the last decade, and increasingly so, is the brain rot and the dumbing down that's happening because we're deferring all of our higher faculties and creative aspirations and intrinsic technical capacities to the computer, to the internet, and now, of course, increasingly to the AI, the tools that only expedite and make these things even more efficient and require less time to input and output ideas and sketches and even entire books and documentaries and films if we so choose. Similarly, we have never in the history of humanity required in vitro fertilization, test tube babies, and all the other strange and creepy ways that they're presenting ideas of creating human beings in collusion with technology and the industry and the science of medicine, replacing and replicating things that, like the womb and everything artificial and synthetic about that, pretending as if that's going to ever be a good thing in the long run, in a way that's sustainable and that will birth healthy, vibrant, organic human beings. That's utter nonsense. And yet, what we're seeing in the modern narrative more and more, and especially through, again, where we're getting all our information and ideas pushed into our brains through social engineering and mind control, which, of course, through the news, through headlines, through best-selling novels, through television shows and films, documentaries, all of these things that are pushed into the faces of as many people as possible, and of course those with the greatest access and the greatest funding and budgets usually get to push their message, their narrative, their ideas, which override the work of those who are actually seeking truth, doing things in an honorable and authentic way, doing things like genuine research, talking to real people, talking to real mothers and fathers, and actually solving legitimate problems such as why infertility exists, such as why birth rates are actually declining, which have nothing to do with the technological solutions being introduced, because it's the same industry offering these tools that has caused this widespread issue and problem of infertility, lowering birth rates, problems with children and autism and all the rest of it. It's the same industry, which is the pharmaceutical industrial complex, the cartel medicine. Their offerings have poisoned generations, and yet we still buy into their nonsense narratives. We still buy into their model. We still buy into what they offer as if their solutions are legitimate and helpful and healing and anything beyond strictly for profit. We've never needed these technological offerings, solutions in the history of humanity, and yet now suddenly in the purportedly most advanced technological era in recent human history, in recent human memory, we have all sorts of problems. And it's a broad-reaching problem because there's a psychological and emotional aspect to it. There's an ideological aspect. There's a political aspect. So every one of these things, physical, financial, governmental, and of course, psychic and spiritual, all of these things are related, and all of them have been fundamentally undercut and underpinned with ideas that have been systematically destroying the family unit and the idea of family and raising healthy human people. And so now they're trying to introduce, because they've created this problem over in multiple generations, the reaction, of course, is we're seeing the numbers, we're seeing unhealthy children, we're seeing declining birth rates and the frailty of the human species, and how are we going to survive this? And on the flip side, you have morons and idiots talking about overpopulation as if that's a thing and could ever be a thing. Complete rubbish. So psychologically, we're being twisted around and distorted into all sorts of delusions and illusions about ourselves, our humanity, and the human species. Plain and simply, it is because of the ongoing assault by the medical industrial complex and the military industrial complex and government state propaganda. It is because of these things. It is because of poisonous injections, poisonous pharmaceuticals, poisonous protocols and procedures from birth into adulthood. It is because of these things that fertility is an issue. It is because of the stress and ongoing psychological and emotional trauma that persists throughout society, with forever wars, forever conflicts, and forever nonsense being perpetuated, such as climate change and all the rest of these fear-mongering narratives that are beating the shit out of our hearts and minds every single day of the week. If we're looking at these screens, if we're looking at the headlines, if we're paying any attention to the news and their bullshit offerings whatsoever, we're being polluted and poisoned and toxified psychologically, spiritually, psychically. And then physically, biologically, we're being poisoned by those who purport to be healers and helpers. And through the therapies and protocols and procedures they offer, they do nothing of the sort. It only exacerbates the problems, and they think that more tech, more pills, more injections, more surgeries, more AI, more technology, that's going to solve the problem that they themselves have created. So just realize that these things are being forced into your mind. And I wrote a piece about this, had a GPT chat about this, and so this is kind of the theme of the day, as it were. So feel free to check out those other offerings, which I will link below this video. And perhaps it'll give you something to think about or to consider. Ways to reframe this nonsensical notion that we're desperately in need for AI and technology and artificial solutions to our weak and frail and pathetic human existence, and how are we going to survive and exist into the future, and all the rest of that. It's all nonsense. It's all a manufactured crisis. It's all made up for the sake of keeping you afraid of shadows, keeping you afraid of the invisible, infighting between others and those who will believe differently because they've been, brainwashed and propagandized to believe certain things, terrified into consent and complacency and complicity. It's a far-reaching game, and it's a long game. It's not something that suddenly just happened and suddenly just turned up in 2020 and onward. These are things that go back generations. The idea of germ theory and all the other nonsense that Rockefeller medicine and all of these centralized authorities keep perpetuating and regurgitating generation after generation, completely falsified and debunked well over a century ago. And yet we forget. And I've talked about this in other videos, and many, many more educated and experienced and well-researched people have spoken far better about this than I have. So I would urge you to look further into it if it is something that interests you, if it's something that concerns you, if you are a parent considering becoming a parent, or if you're struggling and suffering with reconciling with all of the ideas and conflicting notions that are in your mind, and if you have even an iota of any fear from any headlines and nonsense that's being offered by the likes of Elon Musk and Bezos and Trump and Carney in Canada, all of these morons and puppets and paid actors are doing their job. They are consummate liars. They are installed into positions for specific purposes, very little of which has to do with what's best for humanity, what's best for any particular nation or state, what's best for any community. And as we've discussed, as I've discussed through numerous chats with the GPT and other videos, and as many other people have also been bringing up, it all is solved from the bottom up, from the ground up, not from the top down. The top down is where their acid rain and nonsense comes from. The top down is where ideologies and political attacks and social engineering and manipulation comes from. The top down is corrupt to the core, and they will never provide answers. They only have to, for them to justify their existence, such as government and institutions, they have to keep creating problems or manufacturing crises. Otherwise, we would realize very quickly the truth that we just simply don't need them. We never did. So there's many things that human beings have never in their history required to thrive and to live and to perpetuate the species in a healthy and organic and a natural way. Do what you can to wake yourself up. inform yourself about these things, educate yourself about these things if you're concerned, if you're worried, if you're stressed, if you're depressed, and if you feel overwhelmed and dissuaded from living your best life, if you're in any way cowering to their offerings, in any way engaging in futile and ridiculous arguments with people who think they know everything, but they're relying, of course, on some sort of centralized authority. They're relying on their indoctrination and training through systemic and institutional sources. The truth isn't in there. The truth isn't offered in any textbook. It's not offered in any centralized institution or authority. And that gives them all the power because we're trained to defer to them, right? So just consider all the things that have become normalized in your life. Start to question some of these things that are fundamental to a natural, organic human being and thriving without the use of any sort of technology or smart device or anything that the technocratic crowd is throwing at us every single day. Consider what your children are growing up with, what they're exposed to, what you're exposing them to, because it's easy or it's convenient or it's cheap or it saves you a little bit of time and energy and effort. There are no shortcuts. There are no cheats. There are no hacks. It's just natural, living, organic men, women, children. And the simplest truths have always been truths and will always be true. Have a good one.